As an old school teacher, I thought we'd begin with a little exercise this morning. Wonder if you could make a list in your mind right now of the times and places where you have felt the assurance that God is with you. When were the moments when you felt like God was indeed with you, standing behind you? I ask the question because so many times when I'm walking, I meet people that I begin to know fairly well, and every once in a while someone is in a mode of crisis, and they will ask me, where was God when that happened? How come that happened and God wasn't there for me? So I thought it might be a good idea if we remembered all the times when we thought God was with us, and then maybe we could answer, where was God? And know that God was there, still there, even in the most difficult of moments. So what's on your list this morning? Would it be an amazing sunrise? Would it be a walk one day long ago on a beach? Would it be when we stand in the circle at the end of our service each Sunday and sing, "Surely the presence of the Lord is in this place"? I know it doesn't happen every Sunday, but it happens often enough that I'm going to be here. And that is, there is a wind of the Holy Spirit that passes among us and through us as we sing that together in fellowship. Maybe it's singing a favorite hymn, hopefully one of those this morning. Maybe it's walking the labyrinth out on our patio. Some of you have done that and have had a moment when God walks with you. Maybe it's creating something wonderful with your hands. Maybe it's looking into the eyes of a pet and seeing the innocence and the love there. Maybe it's receiving a warm hug from a friend, as many of us have already done this morning. But I get to add something else to the list today. Something totally unexpected that happened. It happened with Don and me some months ago when we were up at the Huntington Library in San Marino, near Pasadena. And I know many of you have been there, and it's a marvelous place. The gardens are fantastic. One of my favorite now is the Chinese garden, because you can have lunch there. Excuse me. And the children's garden, which is just a phenomenal place. Everything's very low down. You can't go on all the paths because you're not low small enough. But we were there to do some research, as we often have. We've been researchers there for some 30 years now, and many of our books and columns are the result of that research. But this particular day, we did as we always do. The first place we visit is the library building. It's the second oldest building on that property, the first being the home of Arabella and Henry Huntington. They built their home, and then Henry had so many books that he had to build a building for his rare book collection. And that's the library building today. And a part of it is for researchers and readers only. But they've added another building, actually, for most of that work. And still, the public can go into the exhibition hall of the library building. If you haven't gone in there, you must go. There's a Gutenberg Bible, one of Audubon's original Birds of America, which is a huge volume because he painted everything life-size. And there's letters that Lincoln wrote, a number of wonderful things if you like books and reading. So we were in there when I noticed an exhibit, as they have special exhibits, which is always something different for us, an exhibit across the wall. And at the top of the exhibit, it said, "Unintended Consequences." Now that caught my eye because I've always had a bit of a problem with the word consequences as a teenager. As a teenager, I wanted to go straight to forgiveness and skip the consequences. Let's get to the forgiveness part. So I've caught the word consequences, but the unintended part, I thought, oh no, I'm really in trouble. I used to be concerned with intended consequences. Now I have to worry about the unintended ones. What are those? What are the unintended consequences? And so let me take you to that wall right now. I want you to walk with me along it. And I'm going to read just 3 of the notes that I wrote. They had quite an exhibit, but 3 of them, and they're all books, as you might guess. This is a library. For these 3 books, I'm going to tell you the author, and tell you the name of the book, tell you what the author intended to do, and then the unintended consequence, okay? You'll recognize all of them. They're good friends. Mark Twain's book, Tom Sawyer, okay? He wanted to tell a good story about life on the Mississippi in the 19th century when he lived there. And he did that, didn't he? But unintentionally, he captured the cadence and the originality of American English in writing. He captured that. And scholars can look at that. We can see that and see the difference that came about because of that book. The second book is like unto it, much earlier though. In fact, it's from the early 17th century. Chaucer, Canterbury Tales, okay? He wanted to tell a good story of typical middle-aged people on a pilgrimage. And he did that, didn't he? Very well. But what he did was something else, actually. He captured Middle English in writing, which became the basis of modern English. Both of these writers captured something about language that would not have been captured if they hadn't written their book about a good story. And the third example is somewhat similar, but it's Audubon in his book of American Birds. He rode on horseback in the early 1800s across the United States, capturing it because he was a good artist and painter, capturing the birds of America, life-size, on big sheets of paper. And it's a wonderful book, still being used. And there's a copy, as I said, there at the library. But he did something else while he was on that journey. He came across something that we really are ashamed of. He came across American soldiers on horseback with rifles, herding, and herding is the only word I can use, 114,000 Cherokee Native Americans on a 300-mile journey from the east to Oklahoma. We know it better as the Trail of Tears. He came across them as he rode. And as he rode past them and through them, he painted what he saw. He painted the soldiers on horseback with their rifles. He painted the Cherokees as they pulled their belongings behind them and walked the 300 miles. And he certified that event so that it could not be denied. He captured it. He captured it for history. And we could not deny what we did to that Cherokee nation. It was an unintended consequence of his journey. Well, after I looked at that exhibit, Don and I talked, and we decided maybe we could add some more literature to the unintended column. And these 3 authors, their unintended consequence came about because they were all put into prison. They were in prison because of their ideas. And the jailers had the idea, if we put them in prison, the ideas couldn't be spread. But there was an unintended consequence to putting them in prison because each one of them finally had the time to write. And they wrote something that you still read today. John Bunyan, put in prison for his religious ideas, wrote Pilgrim's Progress while he was in prison. Cervantes, who applauded and uplifted chivalry and honor, when he was in prison, he wrote Don Quixote. He must have been there a long time. That's the biggest book I've ever read, I think. And Martin Luther King Jr. was put in prison because of his civil rights stand, and he wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail, which is spread everywhere. So the jailers had an unintended consequence to what they did. They gave these men the time to write, and the writings have now spread what they were hoping to stop. Well, just about this time, as I was looking through all these notes, I began to think, what's going on here? All these unintended consequences just happening on their own, all by themselves? Perhaps you're beginning to suspect, as I do, that God's constant and unexpected presence goes to work. And he will work on and on until something is born that gives a victory of joy and of peace. Because every one of these unintended consequences shows God's constant presence. You don't have to ask, where is God? God is here beside you. And the proof of it is that these unintended consequences don't just happen. They are indeed God's will. God's unexpected presence in our lives is assured by all these moments where we have experienced God, and by this phenomenon we have discovered the unintended consequences. We can participate with God in this. In looking at most of these, begin to wonder, are there unintended consequences even from the very worst of things that happened to us? Surely the 3 men who were in prison was a very evil thing that happened to them. But is there anything else that happens that shows an unintended consequence? Could God even work in the worst of times? So I, liking history and being a bit of a historian, thought over the 20th century. What were the worst things that happened in the 20th century? Well, there were lots of them. So many that it's pretty difficult. But one sticks out among all others, and that is the Holocaust. How could the Holocaust be termed anything but evil? And we, Don and I especially, have been a part of the telling of that story. Most of you know that we assist people in telling their story, and we were privileged beyond our dreams when we were privileged by 5 people to tell their story. The books come in all different ways, whatever people want to do with them. But these 5 people are the ones that we have done who were all victims of the Holocaust. 2 spent the entire time in a concentration camp. 1 hid most of the time, and 2 hid part of the time and then escaped, 1 to South America and 1 to the United States. But the stories that they tell, this was the first time they had ever told their stories. And it just, more than any other stories, were accompanied by a lot of tears. Unimaginable circumstances that they lived through. So, could such an evil thing have an unintended consequence? Do you know? It does. At the end of the war, when the Allies went through Europe, going from camp to camp, they were so horrified not only by the 6 million deaths, murders of the Jewish population, but the survivors, these people, marked for their lives if they lived at all. Some had their lives shortened. All suffered physically, some 40, 50 years later. They were so horrified by what they saw, the Allied troops and the leaders, that they decided that they would establish a place where the Jews could be safe, where the Jews would again have their own country. That's why Israel exists today. Israel was the unintended consequence of the Holocaust. And I bet Hitler and his lieutenants never thought of that when they were conducting their evil. Now, Israel isn't completely safe today, as you know. In fact, most of the Middle East isn't very safe. But nevertheless, even the worst of circumstances, God works on and on until something unintended, something that's God's will, happens. And of course, the very best illustration that we have, we celebrated last Sunday, didn't we? On Friday, the Pharisees and Pilate decided they could quiet the message of Jesus by killing him, by crucifying him. And they did, just until Sunday. And then we have the resurrection, and then we have the birth of Christianity, and then we have the spread of the Christian faith around the world. It's an unintended consequence that they put in motion. They probably never thought that would happen. And so we are an Easter people. So we can celebrate Easter every Sunday and every day because that's what God put into place. I have just one other unintended consequence to share with you. A very minor thing, something not in the history books. It is a poem that was the result of World War II, in addition to the Holocaust. A very small little poem that I'm going to conclude with. It was written by a Canadian airman in the Canadian Royal Air Force named John McGee. He shows us the presence of God even as he was flying his plane. He was 19 years old when he wrote this, and he was killed 2 weeks later in battle. There are no other poems from him, but I would say this one is sufficient, and so I conclude with it. Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlight silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my even eager craft through footless halls of air. Up, the long delirious burning blue. I've topped the wind, swept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagles flew. And while, with silent lifting mind, I've trod the high untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touched the face of God. This is the great proclamation of the Christian faith, for God is with us in every place and every time. Amen.